He shuffled through those glass doors with boots so worn the leather had given up trying to hold together. The soles flapped with each step like a broken heart trying to beat. Heads turned, not in respect, in disgust. The security guard's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. The tellers exchanged glances that screamed one word: homeless. But they were wrong, dead wrong. And in 3 minutes, everyone in that Chase Bank branch on Fifth Avenue would learn just how catastrophically wrong they were. The old man approached the counter with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned long ago that the world judges you by your appearance before you even open your mouth. His jacket was military surplus, faded green with patches of wear that told stories no one bothered to read anymore. His hair, silver and thin, was combed back with the precision of someone who still believed in looking presentable, even when the world had stopped caring about his presentation. Sarah Martinez, the head teller, looked up from her computer screen with the practiced smile reserved for customers who probably couldn't afford the minimum balance fee. Her smile faltered when she saw him, not because he looked dangerous, because he looked forgotten. Like so many elderly men who wandered into banks these days, clutching Social Security checks that barely covered rent, let alone dignity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone service workers use when they're all ready, calculating how quickly they can process this interaction and move on to someone more important, someone who mattered. Someone who looked like they belonged in a bank that catered to Manhattan's financial elite. The old man reached into his jacket pocket with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, from age, from years of carrying burdens, too heavy for shoulders that had already carried enough. He pulled out a crumpled envelope, the kind that government checks come in, and placed it gently on the marble counter that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "I'd like to cash this, please," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd given orders when orders mattered, when lives depended on them. But Sarah didn't hear authority. She heard another elderly man asking for help she didn't have time to give. Behind him, a line was forming. Business executives checking their Rolexes. Young professionals tapping impatiently on their phones. A woman in a designer suit who made a show of sighing loudly enough for everyone to hear her frustration. The message was clear. This old man was wasting everyone's time. This old man didn't belong here. This old man should have used the ATM outside instead of taking up space where real banking happened. The security guard, Marcus Johnson, watched from his position near the door. 23 years old, fresh out of training, full of the confidence that comes from never having been tested by real crisis. He saw what everyone else saw, a potential problem. Someone who might cause a scene. Someone who looked like he had nothing left to lose, which made him dangerous in the way that desperate people are always dangerous. But Marcus was wrong too. The old man had everything to lose. His dignity, his self-respect, the last shreds of belief that his country still remembered what he'd given it, what he'd sacrificed for it, what he'd lost for it in jungles half a world away when he was young, enough to believe that service meant something permanent. That honor was a currency that never lost its value. Sarah examined the check with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen every scam, every forgery, every desperate attempt to turn worthless paper into real money. Social Security, direct deposit. The amount was small enough to be tragic, large enough to represent everything this man had to live on for the next month. She looked up at him with eyes that had stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as transactions to be processed or problems to be solved. "Do you have an account with us?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. People who banked at Chase Manhattan didn't walk in wearing boots held together with duct tape and hope. People who banked here arrived in cars that cost more than most people made in a year. People who banked here didn't tremble when they handed over government checks, because people who banked here had never needed government checks. "No," he said simply. "I don't." He didn't explain why. Didn't mention that the account fees alone would eat up a week's worth of groceries. Didn't say that he'd been banking at the small credit union across town until it closed last month, leaving him scrambling to find somewhere, anywhere, that would treat him like a human being instead of a burden. The woman in the designer suit behind him stepped closer, her perfume aggressive enough to announce her presence and her impatience. "Excuse me," she said, not to the old man but to Sarah, as if he were transparent. "How long is this going to take? Some of us have actual business to conduct." That wasn't just any old man in torn boots. If you believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because what happens next will restore your faith in justice and remind you that some stories need to be told, some people need to be remembered, and some moments change everything for everyone watching. The old man didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the woman's complaint. He'd heard worse. He'd endured worse. In rice paddies where bullets whispered, death songs through bamboo leaves. In prisoner camps where dignity was the first casualty and hope died a little more each day. In hospitals where young men learned that coming home didn't mean the war was over. It just meant the battle had moved to different terrain. Sarah's fingers moved across her keyboard with the efficiency of someone who'd processed thousands of these transactions. Check the amount, verify the signature, calculate the fee for non-customers, the fee that would take another bite out of money that was already too little to live on, the fee that was policy, not personal, but felt personal, to someone who counted every dollar twice before spending it once. "There's a $7 processing fee for non-customers," she announced, her voice neutral in the way that customer service voices become when they're delivering news they know will hurt. $7, the cost of a fancy coffee for the woman, tapping her foot behind him. The cost of a meal for someone who'd learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed. The old man nodded as if he'd expected it, as if he'd been preparing for this small indignity on top of all the others. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that had seen decades of faithful service. The leather was soft with age and handling, creased in places where it had bent to fit pockets that had carried it through jungles and hospitals, through protests and parades, through years when coming home from war meant being spat on instead of thanked. Behind him, the line had grown, longer, more sighs, more foot tapping, more phones being checked with theatrical impatience, the universal language of busy people being inconvenienced by someone they considered less important than their time, someone who didn't matter in the grand scheme of their carefully scheduled lives. But Marcus, the security guard, had started watching more carefully. Not because he thought the old man was dangerous, because something about him seemed familiar. The way he held himself despite the worn clothes, the way he kept his shoulders straight even when the world was pressing down on them, the way he maintained his dignity even when everyone around him was treating him like he didn't deserve any. Marcus had seen that posture before. In his grandfather, who'd served in Korea and never talked about it except when he'd had too much to drink on Memorial Day. In his uncle, who'd come back from Desert Storm with eyes that saw too much and said too little. In the homeless veterans he'd volunteered with at the shelter downtown, men who still stood at attention when the flag was raised, even when they had nowhere to sleep when it came down. Sarah counted out the bills with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. 20s, 10s, 5s, 1s. Money that would buy groceries and pay utilities, and maybe, if there was anything left over, cover the prescription medications that kept old bodies functioning when old hearts wanted to give up. She slid the money across the marble counter, along with a receipt that documented this small financial transaction that represented everything to him and nothing to everyone else watching. "Have a good day," she said automatically, already looking past him to the next customer, the woman in the designer suit who'd been broadcasting her impatience like a radio signal set to maximum volume. But the old man didn't move immediately. He stood there for a moment, carefully folding the bills and placing them in his wallet with the reverence of someone who understood the value of every dollar because he'd learned what it meant to have none. He was taking too long. In everyone else's opinion, he was taking too long to complete a simple transaction and get out of the way of people who had important places to be and important things to do. "Sir," Marcus said, stepping forward with the authority his uniform gave him and his age took away. "You're holding up the line." The old man looked up at him then, and Marcus saw his eyes clearly for the first time. They weren't the eyes of someone broken by life, though life had certainly tried its best to break them. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen things that most people couldn't imagine and somehow found the strength to keep believing in things that most people had forgotten were worth believing in. They were the eyes of someone who'd earned the right to take as much time as he needed, even if nobody else understood why. "I'm sorry," the old man said quietly, and meant it. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he'd learned long ago that apologizing was easier than fighting battles that couldn't be won. He'd fought the battles that mattered, in places where winning and losing were measured in lives saved, and brothers brought home. These small daily humiliations weren't worth the energy it would take to resist them. He turned to leave, moving with the careful steps of someone whose body had absorbed more damage than it was designed to handle. Each step was deliberate, measured. The walk of someone who'd learned not to take mobility for granted because he'd seen too many friends who'd lost theirs in ways that made walking anywhere, even slowly, feel like a gift. But as he approached, the glass doors that would take him back out onto the street, back into a world that had stopped noticing him decades ago, something extraordinary happened. Something that would change everything for everyone in that bank, and remind them all that sometimes the most important people are the ones who look the least important. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. Not just any man. A man whose bearing screamed federal authority even before you noticed the small pin on his lapel, the slight bulge under his left arm, the way his eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to spot threats and neutralize them before they could materialize into danger. Secret Service. The kind of agent who stood between presidents and bullets, between democracy and chaos, between the American people and the forces that would tear their country apart. Agent David Harrison had been in the service for 15 years. He'd protected 3 presidents, investigated countless threats, stood watch over dignitaries whose names made headlines and whose deaths would have changed the course of history. He was trained to notice everything and react to nothing, unless action was required. He was trained to be invisible, until invisibility was no longer an option. But when he saw the old man in the torn boots, something happened that his training hadn't prepared him for. He recognized him, not from a wanted poster or a threat assessment file, from a photograph that had hung in his father's study for as long as he could remember. A black and white photograph of young soldiers in a jungle clearing, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling the kind of smiles that only come before you learn what war really costs. His father had pointed to that photograph 1,000 times over the years, telling the same story with the same pride and the same sadness. "That's Sergeant William Patterson," his father would say, pointing to a young man whose face was barely recognizable under the decades of age and hardship that had accumulated since the photograph was taken. "He saved my life in Vietnam, carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his leg and shrapnel in his back. I owe him everything. We all do." Agent Harrison had heard the story so many times he could recite it word for word. How Sergeant Patterson had volunteered for the most dangerous missions. How he'd earned the Silver Star for gallantry under fire. How he'd been wounded 3 times and refused evacuation each time because his men needed him. How he'd brought 17 soldiers home who wouldn't have made it without him. How he'd disappeared into civilian life after the war and never asked for recognition or reward or even acknowledgement of what he'd done. And now here he was, being treated like a nuisance in a bank where people who'd never served anything but their own interests made him feel unwelcome in the country he'd nearly died defending. Agent Harrison didn't hesitate. His training had taught him to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately. But this wasn't about training. This was about honor. This was about debt. This was about recognition that was 50 years overdue and couldn't wait another moment. He crossed the marble floor in 6 quick strides, his leather shoes clicking against the stone with the authority of someone accustomed to having doors opened and questions answered. Everyone in the bank turned to watch. Secret Service agents didn't usually make house calls to neighborhood bank branches, and their presence meant something important was happening. Something that would make their Tuesday afternoon more interesting than they'd expected it to be. "Sergeant Patterson," Agent Harrison said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the bank like snow. Not loudly, but clearly, with the respect that the military reserves for those who've earned it in ways that can't be taught, or faked or purchased with anything except blood and sacrifice. The old man turned slowly, confusion written across his features. Confusion and something that might have been hope, if hope hadn't been beaten out of him by decades of being invisible. He looked at Agent Harrison's face, searching for recognition, for connection, for some clue about why a federal agent was addressing him by rank he hadn't held in half a century. "I'm Agent David Harrison," the agent said, extending his hand with the formality of someone making an introduction that mattered. "My father is Robert Harrison. He served under you in the 1st Cavalry Division, Alpha Company. You saved his life on March 15, 1971, near Firebase Charlie." The confusion in Sergeant Patterson's eyes gave way to something deeper. Memory, recognition. The sudden understanding that the past wasn't as buried as he'd thought it was. That someone remembered. That someone knew. That the things he'd done in service to his country hadn't been forgotten by everyone, even if it felt that way most days. "Bobby Harrison," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades and the wonder of unexpected connection. "Little Bobby Harrison from Tennessee. He made it home. He made it home because of you," Agent Harrison said. "He made it home, and he got married, and he had children, and he told us about you every Memorial Day for 40 years. He told us about the sergeant who wouldn't leave anyone behind, who carried wounded men when he was wounded himself, who earned the Silver Star and 3 Purple Hearts and never talked about them because he said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home." By now, everyone in the bank was listening. The designer suit woman had stopped checking her watch. Sarah the teller had stopped processing transactions. Marcus the security guard had stepped closer, his hand no longer near his radio, his posture no longer defensive. The atmosphere had changed from impatience to attention, from dismissal to recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would remind them all that dignity doesn't retire, service doesn't expire, and heroes don't always look the way movies teach us to expect them to look. Agent Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Not to pay for anything, but to retrieve something he'd carried there for 15 years, waiting for a moment that he'd never expected would come. A photograph. The same black and white photograph that had hung in his father's study, now creased with age and handling, but still clear enough to show young soldiers in a jungle clearing, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling before the war taught them what smiles cost. "My father wanted me to give you this," Agent Harrison said, holding out the photograph. "He said if I ever found you, I should tell you that he never forgot, that none of us forgot, that every good thing in his life, every happy moment, every proud achievement was possible because you brought him home when bringing him home seemed impossible." Sergeant Patterson took the photograph with hands that were no longer trembling. Hands that were steady now, sure now, worthy now. He looked down at faces that were young and hopeful and alive, faces that belonged to men who trusted him to get them through hell and bring them home to families who were waiting and praying, and believing that someone would keep their boys safe. "I remember this day," he said, his voice stronger now, clearer now. "March 10th, 1971, 5 days before the ambush. We were celebrating Jimmy Morrison's birthday. He was 19, wanted to be a teacher when he got home. What happened to Jimmy?" "Morrison?" Agent Harrison asked, though he already knew the answer from his father's stories. Stories told late at night when the bourbon made the memories easier to carry and harder to forget. "He didn't make it home," Sergeant Patterson said, simply. "A lot of good men didn't make it home, but some did. Because we looked out for each other. Because we understood that every life mattered. Every soldier was somebody's son, somebody's hope, somebody's future. We understood that bringing people home was more important than anything else we might accomplish over there." The bank had become completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of people waiting impatiently for business to resume, but the respectful silence of people who'd suddenly realized they were in the presence of history, real history. Not the sanitized version taught in textbooks, but the lived version carried in the hearts and memories of men who'd been young when the world was burning and had somehow found the courage to walk through fire to bring their brothers home. Sarah the teller felt something she hadn't felt in years of processing transactions and calculating fees and treating people like numbers on computer screens. She felt ashamed, not professionally ashamed, but humanly ashamed. She'd looked at this man, and seen only his worn clothes and his slow movements and his small social security check. She'd missed everything that mattered about who he was and what he'd done, and why his presence in her bank should have been treated as an honor rather than an inconvenience. But Agent Harrison wasn't finished. He'd come here on official business. But this had become personal business. The kind of business that couldn't be scheduled or processed or filed away in bureaucratic folders. The kind of business that required immediate action because justice delayed was justice denied. And this justice had already been delayed for 50 years. "Sergeant Patterson," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone speaking for institutions larger than himself. "On behalf of the President of the United States, the Department of Defense, and every American who sleeps safely at night because men like you were willing to stand watch, I want to apologize. We failed you. Not in Vietnam, where you served with honor and distinction, but here at home, where you should have been welcomed as a hero and instead were treated like an inconvenience." He reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out something that made several people in the bank gasp audibly. "A medal. Not just any medal, but a Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor that Congress can bestow. The kind of medal reserved for people whose contributions to American life are so significant that they deserve recognition at the highest levels of government. This belongs to you," Agent Harrison said. "It was authorized by Congress 3 months ago as part of the Vietnam Veterans Recognition Act. We've been trying to locate you to present it properly, with the ceremony and recognition you deserve. My father saw your name on the list and asked me to find you. He said if anyone had earned this honor, it was the sergeant who never left anyone behind." The medal caught the bank's fluorescent lighting and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with their own light. Gold doesn't tarnish the way other metals do. Gold endures. Gold lasts. Gold remains valuable regardless of how long it's been forgotten or how badly it's been neglected. Like the men who earn medals made of gold, it doesn't lose its worth just because the world stops paying attention to it. Sergeant Patterson stared at the medal for a long moment, not moving to take it. Not because he didn't want it, but because he couldn't quite believe it was real. After 50 years of being invisible, of being forgotten, of being treated like his service didn't matter and his sacrifice didn't count, someone was telling him that it did matter, that it had always mattered, that people remembered and honored and thanked him for things he'd done when he was young enough to believe that honor was its own reward. "I don't know what to say," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of emotion that had been building for decades. Gratitude and grief and pride and pain all mixed together in a way that made words seem inadequate to express what needed to be expressed. "You don't have to say anything," Agent Harrison replied. "You already said everything that needed to be said. You said it in Vietnam, when you carried wounded men to safety. You said it when you volunteered for dangerous missions. You said it when you earned the Silver Star and 3 Purple Hearts and never talked about them, because you thought the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. You've been saying it your whole life, just by continuing to live with dignity and honor even when the world forgot to treat you with dignity and honor." He stepped forward and pinned the medal to Sergeant Patterson's worn jacket, right over his heart. The weight of it was surprising. Not heavy, but substantial, real, permanent. A physical reminder that service matters, sacrifice counts, and some debts can never be fully repaid but should never stop being acknowledged. The transformation in the bank was immediate and profound. Sarah, the teller, stepped out from behind her counter, something she'd never done in 12 years of working there, and approached Sergeant Patterson with tears in her eyes. Not tears of pity, but tears of recognition. Tears of understanding that she'd been in the presence of greatness and had almost missed it entirely. "Sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I want to apologize. I should have treated you better. I should have seen. I should have known. I should have understood that some people deserve our respect regardless of how they look or what they're wearing." Sergeant Patterson looked at her with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, no desire for revenge or retribution. Eyes that had learned forgiveness in places where forgiveness seemed impossible, that had practiced grace under pressure that would have broken most people, that had discovered that holding grudges was a luxury that soldiers couldn't afford if they wanted to survive and bring others with them. "You don't need to apologize," he said gently. "You were doing your job. You treated me fairly according to the rules you have to follow. I understand that banks have policies and procedures. I understand that not everyone can know everyone's story. I understand that sometimes we have to judge people by what we can see, even when what we can see doesn't tell the whole truth about who they are. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with his forgiveness. Forgiveness was generous, but it wasn't enough. Not for this. Not for this moment when everything had changed and she had the opportunity to change with it. She walked back to her station and picked up her phone, dialing an extension that connected her directly to the bank manager's office. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice clear and determined. "I need you to come out here immediately. We have a situation that requires your personal attention." Within 2 minutes, bank manager Carlos Rodriguez had emerged from his office, straightening his tie and preparing to handle whatever crisis had developed on his floor. He was expecting a robbery, complaint, or a customer dispute, or some other routine problem that required managerial intervention. He wasn't expecting to find a Secret Service agent, a Congressional Gold Medal, and a World War hero standing in his lobby, while his entire staff and customer base watched in respectful silence. Agent Harrison explained the situation quickly and efficiently, using the kind of precise language that federal agents use when they're reporting facts that need to be understood clearly and acted upon immediately. He identified Sergeant Patterson, described his service record, explained the significance of the Congressional Gold Medal, and made it clear that this was a person who deserved to be treated with the highest level of respect and consideration. Mr. Rodriguez listened with the growing understanding that this was one of those moments that would define his career and his character. He could handle this by the book, following bank policies and procedures and treating Sergeant Patterson like any other customer. Or he could handle this like a human being who understood that some situations transcend policies and require actions that come from the heart rather than the handbook. He chose the heart. "Sergeant Patterson," he said, extending his hand with the same respect that Agent Harrison had shown. "It would be my honor to personally ensure that all of your banking needs are taken care of, not just today, but for as long as you choose to. Do business with us. Sarah, please set up a premium account for the sergeant with no fees, no minimum balance requirements, and full access to all of our services." But he wasn't finished. He turned to address the other customers who were still watching, still listening, still absorbing the lesson that was unfolding in front of them about recognition and respect, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are, rather than who they appear to be. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the marble-walled space, "we are in the presence of an American hero. Sergeant William Patterson served our country with distinction in Vietnam, earned the Silver Star and 3 Purple Hearts, and has just been awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for his service and sacrifice. I think he deserves our recognition and our thanks." What happened next was something that none of them would ever forget. Spontaneous applause. Not the polite, obligatory clapping that people do when they're supposed to show appreciation, but real applause. Heartfelt applause. Applause that came from people who suddenly understood that they were witnessing something important, something meaningful, something that reminded them of values they'd forgotten and priorities they'd lost track of in the rush of their busy lives. The woman in the designer suit, who'd been so impatient 15 minutes earlier, was clapping hardest of all. The business executives who'd been checking their watches were now checking their hearts, wondering when they'd last thanked a veteran for their service. The young professionals who'd been tapping on their phones were now putting their phones away and paying attention to something more important than whatever notifications had been demanding their attention. Marcus, the security guard, stepped forward and saluted. A proper military salute, crisp and respectful, and held longer than regulations required because some moments deserve more than the minimum response. He'd learned to salute in basic training, but he'd never had the opportunity to salute someone who'd truly earned it. Someone who'd done the things that make salutes meaningful rather than ceremonial. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," he said, his young voice carrying respect that made him sound older, wiser, more mature than his 23 years should have allowed. Sergeant Patterson returned the salute with the precision of someone who'd given and received thousands of them, but never one that meant more than this one did. In this moment, in this place, surrounded by people who'd discovered that heroes don't always look heroic, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt honored. He felt recognized. He felt like the service he'd given and the sacrifice he'd made and the price he'd paid had been worth something after all. Agent Harrison watched all of this with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished a mission that was more important than any assignment he'd ever been given. He'd found the man who'd saved his father's life. He'd delivered recognition that was 50 years overdue. He'd reminded everyone present that dignity doesn't retire, service doesn't expire, and every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from or what they're wearing. But most importantly, he'd given Sergeant Patterson something that can't be purchased or processed or filed away in bureaucratic folders. He'd given him back his sense of worth, his understanding that what he'd done mattered, that who he was counted, that his presence in the world was a gift rather than a burden. The medal ceremony that should have happened in the Rose Garden with cameras rolling and speeches being made had happened instead in a Chase Bank branch on Fifth Avenue, with tellers and customers and security guards as witnesses. It wasn't the ceremony anyone had planned, but it was perfect in its spontaneity, meaningful in its authenticity, powerful in its reminder that recognition can happen anywhere when people choose to see each other clearly and treat each other with the respect that every human being deserves. As the applause finally died down and people began to return to their business, Agent Harrison placed his hand on Sergeant Patterson's shoulder with the gentle familiarity of someone who understood that some connections transcend formal relationships and create bonds that last longer than official assignments. "My father is going to be so happy when I tell him I found you," he said. "He's 81 years old now, living in a retirement community in Florida, and he still talks about you every Memorial Day. He still tells anyone who will listen about the sergeant who wouldn't leave anyone behind. Would you be willing to talk to him? I think it would mean everything to him to hear your voice again." Sergeant Patterson nodded, emotion making it difficult for him to speak clearly. The idea that someone had been talking about him, remembering him, honoring his memory for 50 years was almost too much to process. He'd spent so many years feeling forgotten that being remembered felt like resurrection, like coming back to life after being dead so long he'd stopped believing in the possibility of revival. "I'd like that very much," he managed to say. "I'd like to know what happened to all of them, the ones who made it home. I've wondered about them for 50 years, but I never knew how to find them. I never knew if they wanted to be found." "They want to be found," Agent Harrison assured him. "My father has been in touch with 17 other veterans from your unit. They get together every March 15th, the anniversary of the day you saved them. They call it Patterson Day. They've been doing it for 45 years, honoring your memory, telling their children and grandchildren about the sergeant who brought them home. They're going to be amazed to learn that you're still alive, still fighting, still carrying yourself with the dignity and honor that made them proud to serve under you." Sarah had been listening to this conversation while pretending to organize paperwork that didn't need organizing. She'd heard enough to understand that she'd been part of something extraordinary, something that would change how she saw every customer who walked through those glass doors. She'd learned that you can't judge people by their appearance, that everyone has a story worth knowing, that dignity and worth aren't determined by the clothes people wear or the size of their bank accounts. She approached Sergeant Patterson one more time, carrying something in her hand that she'd retrieved from her desk drawer. A small American flag pin, the kind that bank employees wore on patriotic holidays. Nothing expensive or elaborate, but meaningful in its simplicity. "Sergeant Patterson," she said, "I'd like you to have this. It's not much, but I want you to know that every time I see someone who looks like they need help or kindness or just basic human respect, I'm going to remember this moment. I'm going to remember that you can't tell who someone is by looking at them. I'm going to remember that every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated like they matter. Because they do matter. Because you matter." She pinned the small flag next to his Congressional Gold Medal, and somehow the combination of the simple pin and the prestigious medal seemed perfect. High honors and simple gestures, official recognition and personal respect. The grand ceremonies of government and the quiet acknowledgments of individual human beings who choose to see each other clearly and treat each other well. The bank had returned to normal business operations, but the atmosphere had permanently changed. Conversations were quieter, more respectful. Interactions were more patient, more considerate. People were looking at each other differently, seeing each other more clearly, treating each other with the kind of basic human decency that had been demonstrated in the last hour by a Secret Service agent who remembered his father's stories and chose to act on them. Sergeant Patterson gathered his things slowly, carefully, with the deliberate movements of someone who understood that this moment was ending but didn't want it to end too quickly. He wanted to remember everything, the way the medal felt pinned to his jacket, the way Agent Harrison's handshake had conveyed respect that transcended words, the way Sarah's eyes had changed from dismissal to recognition, the way an entire room full of strangers had become witnesses to something important, something that reminded them all that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and recognition, doesn't always come when it's expected. Agent Harrison walked with him toward the glass doors, not because protocol required it, but because respect demanded it. Some moments deserve to be honored all the way to their conclusion, and this was one of them. As they reached the exit, he pulled out his business card and wrote something on the back before handing it to Sergeant Patterson. "That's my personal cell phone number," he said. "Call me anytime, for anything. If you need help, if you need someone to talk to, if you just want to share stories about the old days. My father would never forgive me if I let you disappear again. And honestly, neither would I. You're part of our family now, whether you know it or not. You've been part of our family for 50 years. Sergeant Patterson looked down at the card, then back up at the young agent whose father he'd carried through a jungle half a century ago. The circle was complete in a way that seemed impossible, but felt inevitable. Service had connected them across decades, across generations, across the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. The young soldier who'd saved lives had become the old man who'd inspired recognition, and recognition had become the bridge that connected past sacrifice to present honor. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't express. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for treating me like I mattered. Thank you for reminding me that service means something permanent, that honor doesn't expire, that the things we do when we're young and strong continue to matter when we're old and tired." He pushed through the glass doors and stepped back onto Fifth Avenue, but he wasn't the same man who'd entered the bank an hour earlier. He was still wearing torn boots and a faded jacket, still carrying a wallet that held more memories than money, still moving with the careful steps of someone whose body had absorbed more damage than it was designed to handle. But something fundamental had changed. He was walking taller. His shoulders were straighter. His head was held higher. The Congressional Gold Medal caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with their own light. But the real illumination came from within, from the understanding that he hadn't been forgotten, that his service had mattered, that the young men he'd brought home had lived full lives, raised families, built careers, created legacies of their own, because he'd made sure they had the chance to do all of those things. Behind him, through the glass doors, life in the bank was continuing. But it was different now. Sarah was treating every customer with the patience and respect she'd shown Sergeant Patterson, taking time to really see them, to acknowledge their humanity, to remember that everyone who walked through those doors was somebody's father or mother, or son or daughter, somebody's hope and pride and future. Marcus was standing a little straighter, saluting the flag with more meaning, understanding that the uniform he wore represented something larger than just security and authority. Mr. Rodriguez had called a staff meeting for that afternoon, not to discuss policies or procedures, but to talk about recognition and respect, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are, rather than who they appear to be. He decided that every employee in the bank needed to hear Sergeant Patterson's story, needed to understand that heroes don't always look heroic, that service takes many forms, that dignity doesn't depend on designer clothes or expensive watches, or large bank accounts. Agent Harrison remained in the bank for another 20 minutes, not on official business now, but to answer questions from people who wanted to know more about the man they'd just met. Questions about his service record, his medals, the lives he'd saved, the price he'd paid for bringing other people home safely. Questions that showed they understood they'd witnessed something important and wanted to make sure they understood it completely. He told them about the Silver Star that Sergeant Patterson had earned by exposing himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers. About the 3 Purple Hearts that represented 3 separate occasions when he'd been wounded but refused evacuation because his men needed him. About the 17 soldiers who'd survived Vietnam because one sergeant understood that bringing people home was more important than personal safety or career advancement or any other consideration that might have justified leaving someone behind. He never talked about it, Agent Harrison explained. According to my father, Sergeant Patterson never talked about his medals or his decorations or his heroism. He said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. He said he was just doing his job, looking out for his men the way any good sergeant would do. But my father said there was nothing ordinary about what he did. Nothing routine about carrying wounded men through enemy territory when you're wounded yourself. Nothing standard about volunteering for the most dangerous missions because someone has to do them, and it might as well be you. The woman in the designer suit asked if there were other veterans like Sergeant Patterson, other heroes living quietly among them, unrecognized and unacknowledged for service that had shaped the course of history. Agent Harrison told her there were thousands of them, tens of thousands. Men and women who'd served in Vietnam and Korea and World War II and Desert Storm in Iraq and Afghanistan, who'd come home to civilian lives and never talked about what they'd done or what they'd sacrificed or what they'd lost in service to their country. They're everywhere, he said, driving buses and teaching school and working in hospitals and banks and grocery stores and auto repair shops. They're your neighbors and your co-workers and the people standing behind you in line at the coffee shop. Most of them never talk about their service because they don't think it's important enough to mention. They think everyone else has heard enough war stories. They think their sacrifice was just part of the job, nothing special, nothing that deserves recognition or gratitude. But they're wrong, he continued. Every single one of them deserves recognition. Every single one of them deserves gratitude. Every single one of them deserves to be treated with the respect that Sergeant Patterson received here today, not because they're perfect people, but because they were willing to serve something larger than themselves when service required sacrifice, when duty demanded courage, when their country needed them to stand between democracy and the forces that would destroy it. Outside on Fifth Avenue, Sergeant Patterson was walking slowly toward the subway station, but he wasn't in a hurry anymore. He had money in his wallet now, thanks to the Social Security check that had been cashed without judgment or condescension. He had a medal on his jacket that proved his service had been recognized at the highest levels of government. He had a business card in his pocket with a phone number that connected him to the son of a man whose life he'd saved 50 years ago. But, most importantly, he had something that couldn't be purchased or processed or filed away in bureaucratic folders. He had the knowledge that he mattered, that his life had meaning, that the things he'd done when he was young and strong continued to resonate decades later, continued to inspire gratitude and respect and recognition from people who understood that freedom isn't free, that democracy doesn't defend itself, that some people choose to stand watch so that others can sleep safely. He stopped at a newsstand to buy a paper, and the vendor looked at the medals on his jacket with curiosity rather than suspicion. "Those are some impressive decorations," the man said, his accent revealing recent immigration from somewhere that understood the value of military service, somewhere that appreciated the men and women who were willing to fight for principles that made life better for everyone. "Thank you," Sergeant Patterson said simply. "I served in Vietnam. My grandfather served in World War II, the vendor replied. He always said that soldiers who came home were the lucky ones, but soldiers who brought other soldiers home were the heroes. He would have been honored to meet you. Another connection, another recognition, another reminder that service creates bonds that transcend generations, that sacrifice is understood and appreciated by people who understand what freedom costs and who pays the price for it." The ripple effects of what had happened in the bank were already spreading, touching people who hadn't been there, inspiring conversations about respect and recognition and the importance of seeing each other clearly. Sergeant Patterson folded his newspaper carefully and continued walking toward the subway, but his steps were different now. Not just because he was walking taller, but because he was walking with purpose. He had somewhere to go and people to call and stories to share. Agent Harrison had given him the phone numbers of 17 other veterans from his unit, men who'd been gathering every March 15th for 45 years to honor his memory and celebrate the fact that they'd made it home. Tomorrow, he would start making those calls. Tomorrow, he would begin reconnecting with the soldiers he'd served with, the men whose lives had been intertwined with his during the most intense period of their youth, the brothers who'd shared foxholes and fears and the unbreakable bonds that form when people depend on each other for survival. Tomorrow, he would learn what had happened to all of them in the 50 years since they'd said goodbye in an airport processing center. Young men heading home to restart lives that had been interrupted by war. But today, he was walking through Manhattan with a Congressional Gold Medal on his jacket and the knowledge that recognition had finally come, not in the way anyone had planned it, not with the ceremony and fanfare that such honors usually receive, but in a way that was more meaningful because it was more personal. In a way that reminded everyone present that heroes live among us, that service deserves recognition, that dignity doesn't depend on appearance or wealth or status, but on character and sacrifice and the willingness to do the right thing even when no one is watching. The subway platform was crowded with the usual afternoon mix of commuters and tourists and people conducting the ordinary business of their lives in a city that never stops moving. But Sergeant Patterson noticed that people were looking at him differently now. Not with the dismissive glances he'd grown accustomed to, but with curiosity and respect. The medals on his jacket were conversation starters, recognition triggers, reminders that everyone has a story and some stories deserve to be heard. A young mother with 2 small children approached him hesitantly, her kids hiding behind her legs the way children do when they're curious but cautious. "Excuse me," she said politely. "My children wanted to know about your medals. We've been teaching them about veterans and people who serve our country. Would you mind telling them what they represent?" Sergeant Patterson knelt down carefully, bringing himself to eye level with the children who were now peering around their mother's legs with the wide-eyed interest that children show when they encounter something they don't fully understand but instinctively recognize as important. He pointed to the Congressional Gold Medal first, explaining in simple terms that it was given to people who'd done important things for their country. Then he showed them the Silver Star and explained that it was for helping other soldiers when they were in danger. "Were you scared?" the little boy asked, his voice carrying the directness that children use when they want to understand something that adults find complicated. "Yes," Sergeant Patterson answered honestly. "I was scared a lot of the time, but being scared didn't mean I couldn't do my job. It just meant I had to be careful and smart and think about the other soldiers who were counting on me to help them. My daddy says that being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared," the little girl added, her voice solemn with the wisdom that children sometimes possess when they're trying to make sense of adult concepts. "Your daddy is absolutely right," Sergeant Patterson told her. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. Being brave means you do what needs to be done even when you are scared, because other people are depending on you and you don't want to let them down." The mother thanked him for taking time to talk to her children, for helping them understand that service and sacrifice are real things done by real people, not just abstract concepts they read about in books or see in movies. She took a picture of her children standing next to Sergeant Patterson, a photograph that would go into the family album as a reminder of the day they met a real hero, a real veteran, a real person who'd done extraordinary things when extraordinary things needed to be done. As the subway train pulled into the station, Sergeant Patterson realized that this day had changed more than just his own life. It had changed the lives of everyone who'd witnessed what happened in the bank, everyone who'd learned that recognition can happen anywhere when people choose to see each other clearly and treat each other with respect. It had reminded them all that dignity doesn't retire, that service doesn't expire, that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, but sometimes walks quietly among us wearing torn boots and faded jackets, carrying memories of sacrifice that shaped the world we live in today. The train doors opened and he stepped inside, finding a seat near the window where he could watch the city pass by and think about phone calls he would make and stories he would hear and connections he would rebuild. 50 years after carrying wounded men through enemy territory, he was still bringing people home. Not physically this time, but emotionally, spiritually, bringing them home to an understanding of what service means, what sacrifice costs, what recognition requires from all of us. The Congressional Gold Medal caught the afternoon light streaming through the train window and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with life and possibility. Gold doesn't tarnish. Gold endures. Gold maintains its value regardless of how long it's been forgotten or how badly it's been neglected. Like the men and women who earn such medals, like the service they render and the sacrifice they make, like the principles they defend and the people they protect. Some things are permanent, some things last, some things matter forever, even when the world stops paying attention to them for a while. Today, attention had been restored, recognition had been given, honor had been acknowledged, and tomorrow, the ripple effects would continue, spreading, touching lives, and changing perspectives and reminding people that heroes walk among us, that service deserves gratitude, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look, or where they come from, or what they're wearing on their feet. He walked into that bank in torn boots. He walked out with a Congressional Gold Medal and the knowledge that 50 years of service had finally been recognized. But more than that, he walked out knowing that his story had become part of other people's stories, that his example had inspired better treatment of others, that his dignity had reminded everyone present of their own obligation to see clearly and treat respectfully and honor appropriately. If you believe that every veteran deserves recognition for their service, if you think that dignity should never depend on appearance, if you understand that heroes walk among us every day wearing ordinary clothes and living quiet lives, share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that service matters, sacrifice counts, and recognition can happen anywhere when people choose to see each other with the respect that every human being deserves.